prejudice and hate against Armenians through their website. Armenophobia provides a hub of information and resources that explore the historical roots, manifestations, and the impact of Armenophobia on Armenian communities. We have a fantastic group of panelists and speakers here, and we're going to have extensive questions. And we have really a high quality panel who's actually quite expert and well versed in all of these issues. We start with Michael Rubin, who's a senior fellow at AEI, Talin Hatik, who's an international law and human rights expert, Sosi Tatikian, who's a consultant in foreign policy, security, governance, and attorney Dustin Hoffman, who's got the best name for any analyst that I've ever heard. So round one, we start with Ms. Tatikian. So let me start with you, Sosi. Drawing from your substantial experience in conflict zones such as Kosovo, could you share insights into local Serbian media coverage of the anti-Kosovo propaganda and its impact on public opinion within Serbia? Additionally, do you observe any parallels between this coverage and the anti-Armenian rhetoric and propaganda strategies used by the Aliyev regime?
Yeah, basically, right now, I think any conflict is accompanied with a war of narratives. A war of narrative between conflict parties. And Azerbaijan started the war of narratives still 30 years ago. As soon as it experienced its military defeat in the First Karabakh War, it presented itself as a victim. Well, it was a victim in a way. However, it packaged it in a very dishonest way, without admitting any of its responsibility for starting the First Karabakh War, for starting massacres. And Armenia, since it had won in the war, was a little bit lazy and didn't really adopt a vigorous strategy to counter-react to that war of narratives. As a result, Azerbaijan started spreading disinformation, and basically launched hybrid war against Armenia throughout those 30 years, and claiming that Armenia is an occupant, an aggressor, and about ethnic cleansing, etc., etc. Here, the weakness of Armenian side was that apart from Nagorno-Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians were controlling the surrounding territories, but as we know, it was used as a buffer security zone and a bargaining chip. And the reason that they were not returned, it's a very complex topic to analyze, and I don't think that's our objective today. However, this was used against Armenia, and then Aliyev went further and further every year, and surprisingly, it didn't stop after its military defeat in 2020, but intensified its war of narratives and ethnic hatred campaign. Whole generations of Azerbaijanis have been raised with ethnic hatred against Armenians. And it includes both Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians and also Armenians in Armenia and Armenia as a state. And what is worse is that they launched this campaign of revisionism of history, claiming that Armenians, who are an ancient nation, as everybody knows, have appeared in the region recently, while Azerbaijan is an ancient nation. And first we were laughing because we actually thought nobody is going to take it seriously. However, Azerbaijani regime raised their own population in the same spirit. And as a result, and it's so obvious, even if you spend half an hour on Twitter, this generation was raised in this aggressive spirit towards Armenia. So now we can, of course, draw parallels with other conflicts. My dissertation is drawing parallels between Azerbaijani-Serbian war of narratives and the one between Kosovo and Serbia. However, I don't think we can compare, in a sense that I don't know any other a conflict where the war of narratives is so aggressive as by Azerbaijan. If we compare the conflicts of Kosovo and Nagorno-Karabakh, perhaps they are the most similar conflicts by their start and root causes in 1990s. However, there was a breaking point in the beginning of this millennium when they had totally different dynamics, and it happened because international community did extend huge support to Kosovo to prevent ethnic cleansing and of Kosovan Albanians by Milosevic regime, and launched international NATO-led intervention against Milosevic regime, deployed peacekeeping or rather peace enforcement mission, followed by a large peacekeeping mission, and turned Kosovo into a protectorate. And after 10 years, more than 10 years of negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina, mediated by EU and European Union, that failed, the West decided to accept Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence and grant remedial succession and earn sovereignty to Kosovo. As we see in our case, the dynamics were completely the opposite. And the reason it happened was that we didn't have international support. Armenians in Karabakh didn't have international support. Because of that, Armenia as a state and as a newly independent state stepped in. In fact, we weren't even independent in the beginning of the conflict. We gained independence in the middle of the First Karabakh War. So we had to take over the role that actually NATO and the international community, the West, played in Kosovo, while Albania as a state managed to distance itself. So we got trapped, Armenia as a state, and then we were stigmatized by Azerbaijan and by its supporters like lobbyists as an aggressor, an occupant, etc. Instead, there was no international presence throughout 30 years in Nagorno-Karabakh, and it was turned into a gray zone, and without wanting to monopolize the floor, we saw what happened. Now, basically, this de facto state was literally eliminated, and ethnic cleansing was conducted in 2023 with the permission of international community.
Josie, thank you for the answer. We're going to move on to Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Hoffman, in 2022, Ursula von der Leyen visited Azerbaijan and signed an energy deal, referring to Aliyev as Europe's reliable partner. However, it's noteworthy that the Aliyev regime has consistently promoted Armenophobia rhetoric through his tenure, even glorifying the actions of Ramil Safarov, who was brutally murdered Armenian Lieutenant Gurgen Margarian in his sleep. This raises a question: is Europe compromising its long-standing commitments to human rights values in dealing with the Aliyev regime?
Yes, well, I'm convinced that the European Union compromised its commitment to human rights in this case. Unfortunately, I work at the European Parliament, and when Ursula von der Leyen as a Commission President, went to Baku back then, I was seriously shocked. Because as Parliament, we had in May 21, we had a resolution on the prisoners of war. In March 22, we had a resolution on the protection of cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh because we saw it threatened. And then Ursula von der Leyen goes to Baku and signs a deal. But she didn't just sign a deal for more gas deliveries. She actually facilitated a huge PR show for Aliyev. She went there, they took smiling photos. There are different things how you can handle such a case. She could go and sign a deal and basically also get some leverage on Azerbaijan. She could have asked Azerbaijan, so we want to buy more gas from you. You get money, but we would also like to ask you to show some commitment to human rights. This is something she could have done, but she hasn't done anything. She has not said anything useful towards Armenia since then. And basically, because this happened after Azerbaijan in 2020, as we all know, decided to use military force to solve this solve their geopolitical issue, she somehow endorsed and like gave legitimization to it. She basically gave Azerbaijan a green light for what they did, and this was a huge sellout for any values, or like it was. She made very clear that a value-based foreign policy approach is non-existent at the European Commission or at the European Union. And on the same side, we had those peace talks facilitated by Charles Michel. And unfortunately, we saw Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia signed a trilateral agreement in 2020 in November. And the first time Azerbaijan in December 2020, they took the first positions in Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia and made very clear that they don't feel very committed to this trilateral agreement. There was no response from the European side. We basically asked all, not personally me, but the European leadership asked the parties to basically not resort to force, please return to a dialogue. And interestingly, Azerbaijan, like even after the latest attack, we still basically try to ask the sides to talk. And I'm like, okay, how do you imagine this? There will nobody left to talk. There will nobody be left to have a proper dialogue. This is too late now. And the European Union and its leadership largely contributed to giving Aliyev the confidence to do what he actually did. And this is, it's a shame. And I feel very sorry for what happened, although I don't take any responsibility in it, but I feel really, it's a huge shame. And whenever now they talk about values, I'm like, I would like to scream.
Well, what we've learned is European values end where European profits begins. We know that for sure. Just a follow-up question before I move to Mr. Rubin. This is a very cynical one. I've come to the conclusion that this is actually the outcome in many ways that many people in the EU, and I know for a fact that many people in the bowels of the State Department wanted. To what extent was this mediocre political leaders who don't understand who they're dealing with, and to what extent this is just cold-hearted cynicism as a way to solve this issue?
I mean, there's a lot of cynicism here because you actually, what you could have told, we or the European Union or also other actors could have told Armenia there won't be any support. We don't need to have any peace talks because we're going to let you down anyways. That would have been more helpful for Armenia than like pretending to be helpful, pretending to be there. Also, like the US 1 week before the last assault saying that they won't accept like anything like that. And then now traveling or like going to Armenia and saying like, well, now it happened, so we're not going to do anything. This is not very helpful and also not very honest and towards the Armenian people. I absolutely agree that the European Union let them down and pretended to help in a way, pretended to facilitate peace talks that had, in my opinion, unfortunately, no positive effect and only helped Azerbaijan in completing in fulfilling what they were planning to do. And yes, I do think that for many, I don't know if it was their plan that this result right now was what they wanted, but I think that most just don't care. And I don't think that people in Europe or the leadership of the European Union has any issues with the Armenian people, but I think that they don't have any priority and they honestly don't care. And they try to whitewash their participation now with statements and maybe some money. But I also think and agree that this is not over. So we can't stop like putting pressure on them and we can't let them get away with what happened before. And I still hope, maybe I'm naive, but maybe I hope there can be a change in this policy attitude.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Rubin, you get the privilege of two questions. One of them because of a back and forth that me and you had. And that is, Sosi talked about the different narratives. And part of the narrative is what I call the numbers game of who lived where, how many million refugees, 200,000. It's constantly this exaggeration that's actually designed to make a point, and at this point, to justify ethnic cleansing. That'll be the first question. But the second one is, in prior interviews, President Aliyev has explicitly stated that the was war. Furthermore, Aliyev's assistant, Hikmat Hajayev, deliberately shared articles and interviews containing phrases like "there shall be no gray zone." The European representative referred to crucial inquiry. To what extent continuity of the wow. The poorest people in Pakistan.
Thank you, Eric. Your audio was actually going in and out. So I just want to summarize your second question. You were talking about how President Aliyev had stated that his ultimate goal was war. His assistant, Hikmat Hajayev, shared articles containing phrases, "there shall be no gray zone." In interviews with TRT, others had talked about the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh as a tumor that needed to be cut out. Given this rhetoric, it raises a crucial inquiry. To what extent does this continuity depend on the of Baku, the dictatorship in Baku, depend on this Armenophobia, this language? In effect, does Azerbaijan need an enemy to exist? I'm reminded of when I was in Baku. I was giving a lecture at Khazar University. And everyone, I mean, it wasn't about Armenia, it was about Iran. But of course, Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh came up. And as I was being driven back to my hotel, one of the professors there had said in the car, "Don't believe anything you just heard there. We're all scared to death of the situation here." And when I look at corruption, Azerbaijan should be Dubai. It should be Abu Dhabi. It should be like a Persian Gulf emirate in terms of standards of living and so forth. Except when you look at World Bank statistics, the per capita income in Armenia, in Georgia, none of which have oil, is actually higher. And the reason for that is simply because corruption is so severe in Azerbaijan. And when you consider that's the average, when I've driven along the outskirts outside of Baku, you're basically going back to the Bronze Age in certain regions with mud brick buildings and so forth, because so much money is siphoned off. You've got a situation where Ilham Aliyev needs to distract attention from his own failings in order to perpetrate his regime. And this is coming forward first and foremost. What I worry about moving forward is within the United States, our sense of history is only 2 or 4 years long. And therefore, most diplomats don't have the context which you provided in your question. I worry moving forward that as we talk about a peace agreement, that's like dangling a lollipop in front of American diplomats and so forth, people will assume goodwill, forgetting that there has never been an agreement which Aliyev, father or son, has actually kept. I worry about a dynamic in which this rhetoric will continue. But Azerbaijan, of course, doesn't want peace. They want to benefit from the process, because if they benefit from the process, then they immunize themselves from accountability in terms of human rights violations, in terms of excusing some of the excesses of their regime and so forth. That's a dynamic we need to break. With regard to what we've also said, and I refer to what Dustin Hoffman said, certainly in the United States, there's cold-hearted cynicism. I believe behind the scenes, Jake Sullivan believes that he's the second coming of Brent Scowcroft, and that there's actually a benefit to simply ripping the Band-Aid off without any understanding of the human factor or the historical factor about displacing the indigenous population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, finally, in answer to your first question about the numbers, it's something that's actually very much frustrated me. And the reason is because these numbers, again, the American concept of history is 2 years long. We don't understand the origin of these numbers. Thomas DeWall had done a study years ago that traced these numbers to Haidar Aliyev, and it's become the big lie. If you really have 1 million Azeris displaced, including from regions like Kalbajar, are you really telling me that there is a Boston, Massachusetts hidden in Kalbajar that somehow got completely depopulated, a city that big? No, the rule of thumb, and civilnet.am has done a study of this last September. What you actually have is take whatever figure the Azeris are giving. And if you want to base things factually on the Soviet census, the situation in 1979, the situation in 1989, if you take 40% of what the Azeris are saying, that's probably much more accurate. But under no means, I mean, it frustrates the heck out of me, and I conclude with this. Under no means should any journalist or diplomat worth their salt be accepting statistics from dictatorships. If you can't confirm it on the ground yourself, don't say it. Otherwise, you're becoming a useful idiot for propaganda. Thank you.
Well, Michael, I've worked on, thank you for the response. I've worked on press generation for the blockade and now the invasion for the past 9 months. And the world is full of useful idiots, and you don't even, it's the other side is the exception. Let's move on to Talin Hijik. And this is my question for you. In his announcement, the former mayor of Baku, Hajibullah Ibrahim Abu Talibov, told a visiting German delegation that our objective is the complete elimination of Armenians. You Nazis already eliminated Jews in the 1930s and 40s, so you should understand. This type of hate speech and rhetoric directed at any group, such as Bosnians or Kosovars, would trigger a response from across the world. The question that naturally arises is, why is this hate speech targeting Armenians tolerated? And what legal mechanisms exist to hold politicians accountable for these kinds of actions? And why haven't any of these mechanisms been invoked so far? And I think we need to differentiate between Europe and the United States, because this would not work in the United States because of the First Amendment, but Europe has much more explicit anti-racism laws and anti-hate speech laws.
Thank you so much for the question, Eric, and thank you to Armenophobia.org for hosting me as well and inviting me to this conversation, which has already proved to be extremely interesting. So to the first part of the question, why is this tolerated? I would answer in two brief parts, which basically everyone else that has spoken before me has sort of alluded to. One are other actors besides the Republic of Armenia, and the other is the Republic of Armenia, because it always takes two parties for an event to take place or for a phenomenon to take place. So where is this coming from? Well, Eric, I think you said it best, European, United States, Western commitments to human rights and a fundamental foreign policy that upholds values ends wherever their economic interests begin, or the other way around. That is absolutely always going to be the case. And I say this from the point of view of an international human rights lawyer. Quite painfully, sometimes we have moments of epiphany where states do the right thing, but the truth of the matter is that if there is no outside motivating factor, they won't, because they don't need to. And that takes me to the second part, which is the Republic of Armenia has frankly been sleeping. They were victors in the First Karabakh War and decided it was over, and shut their ears to all of the propaganda happening. Sosi alluded to this too, by the way, that the disinformation that was coming out of Azerbaijan as to to whom does Nagorno-Karabakh belong? What is the history? Who are the Armenian people that live there, and who has a right to that land, which goes along with the overall international perception of ethnic Armenians? It was simply not replied to by the Republic of Armenia, by the Armenian nation, by the diaspora. And therefore, the narrative has quite solidified in the international community over time, because there has not been a adequate response from Armenia or the Armenian nation against this type of hate speech, and we certainly have not demanded that there be a reaction. Now, the second part, very briefly, what are legal mechanisms that we could use? Eric, you're very right. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is free speech, and it is pretty set in stone. I mean, most people, even abroad, have heard about the First Amendment free speech clause, and that it's really hard to overcome there. And hate speech, therefore, is almost impossible to prosecute in the United States. There are, I would also make the distinction between the legal mechanisms for two different things, right? The hate speech itself, and what action does the hate speech actually lead to, right? So this is, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, this is, I think, really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So we have the hate speech, but we also now have genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, which have been committed pursuant to that hate speech and pursuant to that hateful ideology. So I think that's really where the focus needs to be. And I'm, happy and proud to say that the Republic of Armenia understands that extremely well and has been doing a really excellent job in prosecuting the actions that take place out of that hateful ideology.
I think, when we're talking about speech and its effect, it's one of my favorite lines from Hafez, the great Persian poet. He said, the words we speak is the house we live in, which is actually very accurate in this case. We're going to go to round two. Yeah, I'm going to go to Mr. Rubin we're going to round two of these questions. Amidst the recent military incursion and invasion of Artsakh on September 19th, we had the unfortunate seizure of the historically significant 4th century Amaras monastery. This incident, coupled with Azerbaijan's ongoing rhetoric aimed at erasing Armenian cultural, religious heritage, raises questions about the potential fate of Amaras and other historic sites. And unfortunately, I think this, at this point, we're looking at all of the sites being under, these are the sort of the jewels of Armenian history, but frankly, we have to not look at it from a ethnocentric perspective. These are actually jewels of world history. They're going to come under the control of a regime that has systematically destroyed, I would say, more cultural monuments, probably outside of China, but less than ISIS and the Taliban. So why does Azerbaijan continue to manipulate these historical narratives, and yet it gets praised by outstanding organizations like UNESCO?
It's a great question, Eric. And, as I trace my own evolution to where I am now, as I used to be much more pro-Azerbaijani or sympathetic to their cause, the issue which really convinced me and made me understand what was going on was the destruction of the cemetery at Jolfa. Because there is no political or diplomatic rationalization that could be undertaken. It was a pure effort to eradicate a culture, and whatever disagreements I had with the Armenian government at the time, nothing, absolutely nothing excuses trying to erase a history like that. That's not the hallmark of what I would hope would be a diplomatic dispute in the 21st century. That's the hallmark of cultural genocide and a precursor to actual genocide. As to the venality of international organizations, On this issue and others, I've largely been a cynic with regard to the effectiveness of the United Nations and so forth. My evolution might be different than someone like John Bolton, but it leads me to oftentimes the same place with regards to the United Nations or to some broader multilateral organizations, which I see as ways to excuse accountability or deflect attention from ongoing problems rather than to find a solution to stop that ongoing problem. I was in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan, right prior to when the Bamyan Buddhas were destroyed. It seems to be a problem with a subset of ideology which the Azeri regime shares. How to respond to this? And certainly, the United States and other Western countries should be able to afford, at a minimum, what it would take for 24-hour a day, 7-day-a-week monitoring of these sites. Magnitsky Act sanctions need to be put in place, not only with regard to the Jolfa destruction, which was caught on video and has been documented by satellite, but with whatever comes next with regard to these areas. I do not, the only silver lining here is among people like me in the United States policy apparatus who might span the gambit into realism. What the Azeris do and what they believe they can get away with is so offensive that it can change minds. I would only hope and pray that minds could be changed before we lose this millennia-old cultural heritage.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to go back to Talin Hitik. Since the launch of Azerbaijan's most recent military offensive on September 19, the entire population of Nagorno-Karabakh, 120,000 people, women, children, and elderly, have been displaced or are being displaced. In this turmoil, hundreds of lives have been lost, families have been torn apart, children remain missing. Adding to this crisis, Azerbaijan has escalated its Armenophobic rhetoric. The Azerbaijani government-sponsored mass media has innuended with incredulous Armenophobic statements like comparing Armenians to plagues, viruses, even referencing them as cooked food in relation to the devastating gas station fires. There are just a few instances of human rights violations in the prevailing atmosphere of fear for those living alongside Azerbaijanis. Some experts have drawn parallels to the situation in Srebrenica. Given these circumstances, what legal mechanisms within international law can effectively support the rights of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, who are currently facing genocide and state-sponsored hate?
Thank you so much for the question. It's a really good question and an extremely important one as the situation on the ground keeps evolving every single day. So I guess in a really, really pragmatic sense, I'm going to go away from the particular legal mechanisms right now, because the truth is that and Michael kind of alluded to this, the only teeth that can bring boots on the ground for immediate protection within the international system is the United Nations Security Council. Under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, this is really the only part of the UN apparatus that has any teeth that can mobilize in some sort of a quick fashion. Quick is obviously very relative in this context. For a long time now, and this conflict is the best example, the permanent 5-member structure of the UN Security Council has been critiqued by international legal scholars for a very, very long time. It is an ineffective process, and it leads to a lot of lack of confidence in the international system as a whole. The veto power of the P5 members, most notably in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh, is Russia, to some extent China, to some extent the United Kingdom. So that's 3 out of 5 that would most likely veto any call for a United Nations mandate in Nagorno-Karabakh for immediate protections. That's not our immediate best solution in the international system. Let's move over to legal mechanisms for accountability, because that's really where we do have a lot of particular solutions, and that's where I think the most hope lies. So first and foremost, we have the International Court of Justice, which is an interstate tribunal. And as I'm sure a lot of viewers are already aware, Armenia has actually filed a complaint against Azerbaijan in the International Court of Justice, and that case is ongoing. And then immediately after that filing of the complaint, Azerbaijan filed almost an exact mirror complaint against Armenia. So we now have two joint cases, Armenia versus Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan versus Armenia. And why am I bringing up this case in particular? This case is alleging, as I mentioned before, the acts that come out of the particular hateful ideology that spurs this kind of behavior from official actors that could be attributed to Azerbaijan. So this is this comes out of violation of the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And essentially, the complaint alleges that all of the genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, treatment of POWs, erasure of cultural heritage, all of these particular acts have a direct nexus to racialized and hateful ideology and hate speech in Azerbaijan, which is a violation of that particular convention. We've had a lot of success. I think my personal point of view is that the case so far has been pretty successful. We've had some preliminary orders, which are a pretty big deal, that made statements that forced Azerbaijan to at least pretend to reverse course. For example, dismantling the trophy park in Baku. A small step, but I think it's a really positive step. So that's one of the legal mechanisms for accountability. But if we're talking about who can come in and protect, this is going to take some unilateral action. I think this is going to take some motivation on the part of most likely the United States.
Thank you for that answer, Talia. We're going to move on to Mr. Hoffman again. This is in regards to sanctions. Immediately after Russian aggression into Ukraine, there was immediate sanctions against Russia, hitting them very hard economically. In fact, I think we've had 10 or 11 rounds of those by now. While literally in a somewhat similar case, and last year when it was a direct actually invasion of Armenia, in the exact same case, there has been absolutely no talk of sanctions against the Aliyev regime. And you see language like explaining away ethnic cleansing, like people decided to flee, like it's a choice that they made. And obviously this raises the issue of double standards. And I'm going to throw in something else, which I've always noticed, and I don't know to what extent this is true in the European context. Are Armenians in general, are we just too white for the left and too dark for the right? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, let me start with the double standards. Yeah, well, I do agree. I do that the EU leadership likes to rely on values if it suits to geopolitical interests. And when Russia attacked Ukraine, and we had a really strong response from the European Union, I was actually quite happy to see that. Because I remember how the European Union stayed absolutely quiet in 2020 when Azerbaijan attacked Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think personally also it doesn't matter what you think in terms of international law. However you think, if it's like, is it part of Azerbaijan? Is it a de facto state? The thing is that I always thought that we came to the conclusion that we don't want to resort to military force. And however, there was no reaction, like literally none. Also, even the European Parliament, which usually is quite vocal about everything, only had a debate and without a resolution. There was actually quite sad. So when Russia attacked Ukraine, I was actually I got my hopes up that maybe people realized that it is like using military force is something bad. But unfortunately, it seems like this this conclusion is limited to this conflict once again. And now there are thoughts and prayers for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also still no real action. And if it comes to sanctions, we had this Borrell's statement, the High Representative had a statement on Azerbaijan's attack on Nagorno-Karabakh, on Artsakh, but it was not an EU statement. It was only Borrell's statement because Hungary blocked it, they vetoed it. So we didn't have like a EU27 statement, and this is extremely sad, and it strongly indicates how difficult it will be to get sanctions through. The sad part is, again, the European Parliament got way louder after the 2020 war. I said better late than never, but for example, the Parliament already asked for sanctions if, in case Azerbaijan would not comply with the ICJ orders on the blockade of the Lachin corridor, but there was no response. And just recently, very recently, the European Parliament again asked for sanctions for human rights violations, this time in particular for the case of Gubat Ibadoglu, because Azerbaijan doesn't only treat Armenians badly, but also their own people. And but still, I don't see it coming. The situation is extremely difficult amongst member states because, as you probably know, for example, Germany's wealth somehow was in the recent years built on cheap Russian gas. Suddenly, there is no cheap Russian gas anymore, so Germany has to buy stuff somewhere else. And I personally also think that Germany doesn't have interest in other states. So I think Germany doesn't get a lot of gas from Azerbaijan, but they also don't want to have more competition in the liquid gas market. So if other countries would now stop getting gas from Azerbaijan, they would compete with Germany on the market. And yeah, even countries like Italy has the pipeline from Azerbaijan. I'm sure they don't want sanctions. Azerbaijan took advantage of the situation with Russia. For example, they stepped in Bulgaria with gas supplies when Russia stopped the deliveries. And yeah, they played this quite well. And I do think that right now the priority is the economic benefits from gas deliveries somehow. And unfortunately, it's not human rights. Unfortunately, it's not the life, the existence of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I'm also very afraid it's not the Armenians at all. But I am convinced it's not about colors, light or dark. I think this is like mainly economic interests. Doesn't make it better, but it is still very sad because I always, in a naive way, believed in this European idea and the values. And this is it's tough to see that it was more a dream than reality.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. One thing that I always noted is, everybody talks about the importance of gas. Well, let's just look at it practically. No one is saying that you should stop buying Azeri gas. But if, for example, if you put in Magnitsky sanctions against the criminals in the regime, not the ordinary people of Azerbaijan, I'm sorry, what choice does Aliyev have but to continue selling his gas? His pipelines go in one direction, and he will starve to death. His country earns 90% of its income from oil and gas, so he has no choice but to play ball with Europe. And the thing that I don't understand is why people don't understand that you actually hold power over him and not the other way around, because he has no choice, because he would, without the income, not only his regime, the entire country collapses. And as we know, in the long run, regimes like this, frankly, don't really have a future unless you're transitioning in an aggressive way right now. I'm going to move on to our second question for Ms. Tafikyan. On prominent Azeri Telegram channels, there have been ads put up disseminating photos of missing Armenian children and women, with people offering to buy or rape women or children for $500. But, we have seen similar type of outrages when it was done by ISIS against the Yazidi population. But this kind of outrage, frankly, has not gotten any attention from neither human rights organizations or from the West. How do you explain that?
First of all, there were a number of statements by UN human rights bodies, such as special group of experts, rapporteurs. However, I think it's late. There was a statement by the advisor on prevention of the genocide. So I think we are a bit exaggerating the significance of statements. It's an Armenian thing because we are just monitoring all the time what kind of statements are pronounced by different international actors. But unfortunately, I would say that we had to be more practical in that sense. We had to achieve more practical steps by the international actors and not retrospectively like now, because now there is quite an outrage in international community. But before when it wasn't so late, and it could serve as a tool for preventive diplomacy. The reason why now reactions are not the same as 10 or 20 years ago in other conflicts also has a geopolitical reasons, because in the beginning of this millennium, it was the time of liberalism when, based on Boutros Ghali's agenda for peace, international peacekeeping had a kind of renaissance, and the West, led by the US, were very keen on interventions aimed at human rights protection, and responsibility to protect principle was introduced. However, this time is unfortunately over. We have to face it. The current UN Secretary General Guterres has produced a new agenda for peace in July past year, which basically admits that because of the geopolitical situation and the polarization in the UN Security Council, it's nearly impossible to achieve any Security Council resolution. We saw its impact on other conflicts, such as in Syria or in Myanmar. So now, apparently, the principle of territorial integrity in light of the Ukraine conflict has become a kind of the new Bible. And yeah, it does have a negative impact on human rights issues. And it seems that the principle of self-determination is literally forgotten. And I think that the end of Nagorno-Karabakh as a de facto state, the official announcement about it today, is actually tragic. It's tragic not only for Armenians, it's tragic not only for Nagorno-Karabakh, it's tragic for the liberal, human rights-based global order and the principle of self-determination. And international community should draw serious lessons. Like for me, the State Secretary of Blinken and USAID Chief Samantha Power now are themselves saying that there is a need for international presence in Nagorno-Karabakh. However, the way how Azerbaijan tricked, and now I'm talking not just about the US and UN, but also European Union, because I am currently based in Brussels, and I've been involved in very active public diplomacy with the European Union. So they chose this word integration. This was very, very smart by Azerbaijan, because the term integration has a very positive connotation in the US or in the EU. So I was trying my best to explain to European and American officials and diplomats that this is not the kind of integration you have and you understand. This basically means either, in the best case, subjugation, and absolute establishment of political dominance without giving the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians political and civil rights, and depriving them of their basically ethnic identity, suppressing their ethnic identity, and giving them only these routine social and economic rights, which are basically needs and not fundamental deep rights. And it will, in fact, lead to ethnic cleansing, because if Armenians don't have at least a level of autonomy, and if they are not able to preserve their self-governance institutions, at least part of them, and if they don't have at least like a police and self-defense, a small capacity to feel safe, they cannot stay there. And there was some understanding of that, I have to admit, by the American and European interlocutors, but they were saying that they have no leverage to exercise on Azerbaijan. And I agree with Dustin Hoffman that I'm sorry, I don't believe in this, because I think that EU could use conditionality, even the gas deal, to pressure Azerbaijan, and US administration could do what it is doing in the last 3 days until the last 2 weeks, when it wasn't too late. So it could pressure Azerbaijan to accept international presence. And in that case, if there would be an international presence, and if they could preserve some of their self-governance institutions and some degree of autonomous status, they could stay. So this is very tragic. And I think everybody involved needs to draw lessons. And I also think that Azerbaijan cannot be allowed to get away with this, whether this is the end of Nagorno-Karabakh or not. But I would actually ask a question to Ms. Tallinn, because the one example that comes to my mind is the Gambia's case against Myanmar in line with the Genocide Convention. I've been talking with my law professors about those issues, who are actually outraged with what is going on now. And I worked in Gambia, so I know a little about this case, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think that we could make a case. However, Azerbaijan conducted ethnic cleansing, and there is no question about it, but you know that the term genocide is controversial both in policy and academic circles, and everyone is really careful with this term. And I don't know whether if this is just an ethnic cleansing but doesn't fall under Genocide Convention, whether there can be actually a case in line with Gambia versus Myanmar case.
Sophie, I'm the one who gets to ask the question.
Sorry, but this is an important one.
I will. When she's answering the next question, she's up, she can answer it. Tallinn, we're moving to round 3, and at this point, I would ask everyone to not limit what you're saying, just make it more concise. Considering decades of state-sponsored propaganda fostering hatred towards Armenians, the rewriting of school history books, the relentless propagation of hatred towards Armenians, the cultivation of a culture that promotes nationalist and fascist ideologies, like for the groups like the Grey Wolves, and consistent efforts to erase any trace of Armenian traces, cultural traces. Do you believe that feasibility, is it possible for these two nations or these two peoples to be able to coexist, both if they were going to inside of Artsakh, which at this point doesn't seem possible at all, or even between these two nations or states?
Thank you for the question, Eric. Stolzi, very, very briefly, I'm going to answer by saying to you that we don't need the procedural hurdles that the Gambia and Myanmar case went through, because the issue in that case was that there was a jurisdictional problem, and therefore the Gambia was forced to use the principle of erga omnes, meaning that genocide applies to everyone and is a damage to everyone. In our case, it looks a lot more like the current case of Ukraine versus Russia, which is also a genocide case, which actually just had their hearing yesterday in the International Court of Justice. So I would refer to looking to that case as more of a relevant example for who the complainant would be. And then, of course, it goes without saying that we wouldn't want to do anything to undermine the current case in the ICJ already happening. Maybe they can attach genocide, that there is a procedural way to do that in the ICJ. We should talk to Yeri Shekiri-Agosian from the Republic of Armenia and give him any help that we can to see if we want to launch a genocide convention case as well. To answer Eric's question, I'm going to very, very briefly answer that by telling you a short story about 10 years ago when I was an international law student at the Hague Academy of International Law. They had, in the beginning, when you get to The Hague, they have this sort of parade of embassies, and they have a list of all the embassies in The Hague, and every one of them has an open invitation, sort of an open house for all the students at the Hague Academy. And I looked at Azerbaijan, and they were on the list, and I thought to myself, well, I don't have an Armenian last name. I have an Armenian first name, but they might ignore it. And I have an American passport, and I'm really curious to visit them and just see what it's like, because I know I can't go there as an ethnic Armenian who spent a lot of time in the Republic. So I went to the Azeri embassy as a student of the Hague Academy. And I had friends around me that I said to them, this is going to be interesting, but hopefully it'll just be cordial and they'll do what every other embassy did, which is, this is our country, this is our culture, welcome to The Hague, and good luck in your future as an international lawyer. That's basically how it went. So we sat down at the Azeri embassy, and they spent the next 2 hours detailing to these international lawyers from 27 different countries how the Republic of Armenia had violated international law and how the Republic of Armenia had no interest in international law, and how you as international lawyers from Colombia, Italy, Mauritius, South Africa, Singapore should dedicate your career to prosecuting these crimes against the Republic of Armenia. And I tell you this story to tell you that it is a part of the Azerbaijani identity in a way that I had not realized before that experience. It is a part of the identity in a deeply, deeply rooted way. So if we're going to get past this, we're going to have to pass over a generation, maybe 2 generations, in order to live peacefully side by side. And I would also say that Armenians are going to have to take some accountability as well. I mean, you can't have any resolution if both sides are intransigent. So Armenia is going to have to be peace-oriented and stop this intransigency from their side as well. But for sure, I think at least 1 or 2 generations need to pass, because this is a part of their identity.
Thank you for that. Michael, I'm going to ask a question that is a little bit distant from today's topic, but I think it actually leads to it. There's obviously a narrative of who's what, legal ownership, law, as far as the history of this region, Nagorno-Karabakh. Now it's sort of like a given that this was part of Azerbaijan and there was no question. But in fact, even the United States, throughout most of the negotiating process, always understood that the Nagorno-Karabakh itself, not the surrounding occupied territories, had a distinct status, a legal status actually. And that's sort of dissipated over time, and it's actually made this kind of maximalist rhetoric more possible, because if the other side has absolutely no legal agency, it's just much more easier to say, well, it's my way or the highway, and promoting aggression. And I know you are an expert on this topic in many ways, actually more so than other people. Can you give a little bit of a history of this narrative over the last 30 years of what the U.S. position was about Nagorno-Karabakh itself as a legal entity?
Absolutely. The reason you saw me fiddling around with my computer while you were asking the question is I was uploading to my computer some scans of James Baker's book, his memoirs. And on page 524 and 525, he actually addresses this issue in terms of what the U.S. position was vis-a-vis the Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, Armenia back in 1991 when when the republics were able to reassert their independence. Short answer is it's a myth that the United States simply gave blanket recognition to Azerbaijani sovereignty. It's actually much more nuanced, that while we recognized the borders of the former Soviet states, at the same time, the U.S. position was dependent upon a jointly arrived at diplomatic settlement that in part took into account local desires for self-determination and so on. So what we're really dealing with today is a big lie. It's a position based on a myth. And it's just an unfortunate tendency within the State Department, which ever since the Kissinger era has 2-year rotations, to not have the depth of that institutional knowledge. One quick anecdote. When I worked in the Pentagon during the Bush years, there was a question in the Interagency National Security Council process about the extent our legal ability to reach out to Iranian opposition. And the State Department was arguing that the Algiers Accords of 1981 prevented this from happening. The United States had agreed not to interfere, however you wanted to interpret that, in Iran's domestic politics. I was, as a young aide, I called up Dick Allen and Bud McFarland, both of whom were national security advisors at the time. And they said that when the Algiers Accords were signed, that was not our interpretation of it. And I took that back to the National Security Council, and the State Department had to withdraw their interpretation. What we really need to do is go back to the facts. This is why I think the formal dissolution of Artsakh is a mistake, because as Sosi has talked about, this is about self-determination. The Republic of Armenia cannot negotiate that away on behalf of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. Second of all, Ilham Aliyev has violated his previous agreements, every single one of them, in which he agreed to negotiate the fate of this. That means that by seeking to impose a solution through military through the gun, something he could never achieve through a ballot box, that it's fundamentally an illegitimate and I would argue temporary end to the solution. We've all known that Ilham Aliyev needs to withhold people's social security benefits and other state aid, trying to force them to move back to Karabakh. Because apropos of your first question, most Azeris don't want to live there. Frankly, during the Soviet period, they didn't want to live there when Haidar Aliyev tried to force them to. And therefore, if a vacuum ever develops in Azerbaijan, I wouldn't be surprised to see the tables turn really quickly. Remember, in a democracy, leaders wake up every day knowing where their term ends. In dictatorships like Azerbaijan, leaders wake up every day wondering whether today could be their last. There's a fundamental lack of self-confidence that permeates the Azeri state. We shouldn't defer to their rhetoric on this. You're absolutely right. Another, very briefly, because I don't want to go on too long, this reminds me of the Taiwan case. If you do a deep dive in Taiwan, it hasn't belonged to China for more than 10 or 15 years out of the last 500. Because even when the Qing dynasty controlled it, the Chinese didn't consider the Qing to be Chinese. They considered them to be Mongolian. And so Nagorno-Karabakh is much the same way. What we're seeing now, and what Jake Sullivan doesn't understand in the National Security Council, is what we are seeing is, for the first time, Baku truly trying to get control of this. And when we see the human flight from Nagorno-Karabakh, that's a result of the fact that Azerbaijan has never really been there before, and people are afraid for reasons which Colin has talked about, Dustin has talked about, Sosi has talked about, and you have written a great deal about. For reasons, I mean, people have every right to be fearful based on the rhetoric of Armenophobia, as well as the fact that Ilham Aliyev has never, you can't repeat this enough, he has never upheld a single agreement. I mean, and I could go on, but let me turn the floor back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Michael. That was an excellent answer. Sosi, what we want to look at the what I call the double standard issues on this Armenophobic rhetoric. There are things that can be said about Armenians that really cannot be said about anybody else. I mean, the obvious example is the Jewish community, but I think that's too obvious of a one because everybody knows about the history of that in Europe. But even someone as wretched as Vladimir Putin has never used the kind of language that Ilham Aliyev has used against and about Armenians. For all of his fault, he has never called Ukrainians viruses or pledged to chase them as dogs. And as horrendous as the Russian regime is, even in areas today that are occupied by Russia and Ukraine, there are Ukrainians who live there. They might not like it, but they are not immediately caught and killed. Obviously, they're politically suppressed, but it's a different level of suppression. And we see absolutely no response from the international human rights community to this kind of rhetoric. What explains that?
That's a difficult question. What you are calling a double standard, I'm calling a multiple standard. I think there are a lot of different reasons in different approaches by international community to similar problems in different conflicts, different but similar conflicts. So the first, of course, we talked about geopolitics. The second is Ms. Tallinn mentioned, and I also mentioned, is the Armenian laziness, because throughout 30 years, we have been quite laid back and haven't really done this aggressive, in a good sense, diplomacy and war of narratives campaign that Azerbaijan has conducted. So Azerbaijan has repeated the same thing so all over again for 30 years, and it has had some impact on international community in terms of their perceptions towards Armenian Azerbaijani issues. The third issue is that actually Azerbaijan invests a lot of resources that Armenia doesn't. Look at their thousands of trolls and users, state propaganda, and all those experts and think tanks and activists that are apparently linked with the regime that are harassing all of us, just a small amount of Armenians on Twitter. And they are actually, it's like, sometimes I feel like they have got special training, because as soon as we draw a parallel, let's say I am always used to draw parallels. For instance, when the starvation started in Artsakh, I wrote this article drawing parallels with the Ukrainian Holodomor, with Holocaust, with Bosnian case, siege of Sarajevo and then Srebrenica, showing that starvation was used by Hitler, by Stalin regime, and by Milosevic in other conflicts. And as soon as they see anything like this, they first do these mirror claims. As again Tallinn mentioned, they immediately do mirroring, because when some of us drew a parallel between Hitler and Aliyev in terms of making people to deliberately starve, they immediately turned it against us and started comparing the Armenian leadership to Hitler, because of which they got trouble with the Jewish lobby. But then they used the Jewish lobby against us. I mean, not the Jewish lobby in general, but this particular group of Jewish who wrote a letter saying that they are outraged with the parallels that Armenians are using between the Jewish Holocaust and what is happening now, which was extremely unfair, of course. And, you know, they also take advantage of this notion of the uniqueness of Holocaust, saying that nothing else can be compared with the Holocaust. And in fact, no two genocides or no two conflicts can be completely compared, because each conflict or a genocide or ethnic cleansing case is different. However, a few nights ago, I spent the whole night watching the movie about what has happened in Srebrenica. And to be honest, it was chilling, because 80% of what happened in Srebrenica happened in Nagorno-Karabakh recently, starting from blockade and siege, ending with starvation, the deprivation of basic supplies, and then what happened there is the same as happened in Karabakh. Military forces entering, negotiating with peacekeepers that they wouldn't use any force to defend the civilians, and then convincing the local forces to disarm, and then to surrounding them. The only thing that, thanks God, hasn't happened yet is separating men and slaughtering them. And I very genuinely hope that at least this one is not going to happen, because now I feel like most of the people coming to Armenia are elderly women and children. And I think that the number of men is not large yet. And I really hope that this tendency of detaining Armenian officials who served in Nagorno-Karabakh administration is going to stop, because that's exactly what resembles Srebrenica, because they target men specifically, and international community should at least stop this tendency and allow men not to become hostages of Azerbaijani regime in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Thank you for that answer. I think I want to clarify one thing, that the rabbi's letter was frankly from a very marginal group of ultra-Orthodox rabbis who were frankly not integrated into a whole hell of a lot. And I suspect many of them didn't even know where they were signing. But, you know, most of them, I mean, the other things you outlined are actually obviously have happened and are used by the other side to minimize the crimes that they commit. Mr. Hoffman, you're going to get the last question. There was a horrific trophy park in Baku, which frankly was, you know, as far as the stereotypes of the Armenian soldiers with gigantic noses and looking like subhumans, it was literally straight out of Nazi propaganda. I hate to make that comparison, but I've never seen anything like it. It's the first thing that popped in my mind when I saw those images. And some of those places have been routinely visited by EU officials or EU country officials. And other locations, places that were ethnically cleansed, you know, they show up, they take pictures. This would be unimaginable. There's not going to be, no one's going to go to the occupied areas of Ukraine to show their face, not even people from Hungary. Why is this tolerated on the EU level to give credence or to legitimize this kind of hatred that no one would really accept in their own country?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. I've been asking that myself for quite a while now. Regarding the trophy park, I have no idea how people can go there. It's just appalling, and I'm glad that, as far as I know, Azerbaijan had to dismantle the mannequins, at least. And I absolutely feel what you said, because as a German, I'm very careful with making comparisons. But this Nazi propaganda came to my mind. It was so, and also, I mean, they didn't get the story straight. It was interesting. I probably remember that the creators of the mannequins actually in an interview said that they were asked to make them look especially ugly, and So I'm glad they had to remove them, but still the trophy park is there. I saw that they recently also added new pieces, and it's just like crazy that they organize school trips for little children. So they keep actually, while pretending to the willingness to integrate the Armenians of Karabakh into the Azerbaijani society, they still keep this hate propaganda coming. They bring children there, they tell them how bad the Armenians are, they tell them to celebrate the death of the Armenian soldiers, basically, because that's what the trophy park is about. But I also think that you're right, you already mentioned it, there have been way more symbolic visits, like visits to Shushi, which like Azerbaijan is touring, bringing people there, foreign journalists, but also diplomatic, like diplomats. And I have, like, for several times, I asked the German government, like on Twitter or in statements, I always asked them, like, how is it possible that the German ambassador to Azerbaijan went to Shushi and visited the city after the official line, and if it comes to the foreign policy line towards Azerbaijan and Armenia, is that nobody can get a better negotiating position by military force. And then Azerbaijan takes this town by force, and the German ambassador goes there. And it's not like it was not a normal military campaign, but Azerbaijan's military campaign in 2020 was accompanied by systematic grave war crimes, which are well documented, which are like by NGOs, by Amnesty, but the public executions, beheadings, especially against elderly people. You all know the report, last ones to flee from Amnesty, because were the old people who were not able to flee from the advancing forces, and they were tortured and killed. And then to send the German representative to such places I have no understanding for that. Why it happens, I don't know, because, and this connects my answer to my last answer and your remarks. I personally think that Azerbaijan needs the EU and also Germany more than we need them. And this is also, like, for state sovereignty somehow embarrassing. Like, we have like such a little dictatorship. I mean, they basically can do with us whatever they want, and I don't get it. I do, like, yeah, for us it's embarrassing. For Armenia, it's threatening the existence of the statehood, and I have no understanding, and I cannot explain why they go there, and they also can't. They just don't. They go there and they refuse to answer. They just don't give an explanation.
Well, as far as thank you for that answer. We're done with our questions. As far as not answering, we dealt with that with Ms. Powers here, who held a press conference where she wouldn't answer questions, and then Ms. Kim, who was actually hidden from view. So we're well aware of what they don't answer. On this very horrible topic, on a funny note, is because if you look at all the mannequins they made, they all had gigantic noses. And if you've ever seen the president of Azerbaijan, I really wouldn't go there as an attack line. So I don't know where he got off with that. What I would, we're going to close, and I want to give each of you 2 minutes to wrap up what you're saying, and then I'll finish with a closing statement, and we will finish this horrific topic with a wonderful panel. So we'll start with you, Ms. Tallinn. Please start, and we'll work our way down.
Thank you. I see that there was a question. I'll attempt to sort of answer that question that I see in the chat regarding self-determination. Of course, there is a notion of external self-determination that is creating a sovereign state out of a people, a defined people. The audience may recall that literally the Republic of Artsakh already did that in a referendum in 1988. As far as I'm concerned, that referendum should still
91.
hold.
That was 91.
91. All right, thank you. So yeah, the referendum was in the late 90s, but there is nothing to have counteracted that referendum except for the pogroms that started afterwards. So from a legal point of view, legalistically, in international law, that referendum still should have entered into force at the time. Eric, did you have a comment? Okay, like you were going to refute it. I wanted to know. And this very much pains me to say, because last week I gave a talk talking about the option of remedial secession more than a week ago. I think that ship has sailed for the time being, but it is not to say that the Republic of Artsakh will never exist in the future. And let me just say that the Kosovo brand of remedial secession that was more or less successful in the case of Kosovo is very parallel to the Nagorno-Karabakh situation, especially given the atrocity crimes that are being committed against the people. One last thing I'll say to end my remarks here. Anyone who listens or views this recording, if you'd like to take a look at UN special rapporteurs, I recommend the Special Rapporteur on Racism, Special Rapporteur on Indigenous People. We have to remember that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh are indigenous to that land and fall squarely under the definition of indigenous people in terms of all of the United Nations rhetoric. There's no codified definition of indigenous people, but all of the language used in different conventions and soft law regarding indigenous people applies to the people of Nagorno-Karabakh squarely. So we should be talking to the UN Special Rapporteurs. There is a way to file individual complaints as an organization. If you have an organization or if you are individuals, if you belong to a school, an academic institution, you can file individual complaints. So if this is something that appeals to you, I'm happy to give you instructions and talk you through it, but there's also lots and lots of information online. And what we're talking about here is trying to make some sort of a difference and stopping this record that Armenians have of staying completely silent, letting the international community make up their own mind. Let's not do that anymore. Let's give the facts, let's counter misinformation, and let's get caught trying.
Thank you, Tommy. Let's move on to Mr. Hoffman for your last statements.
Yes, well, in conclusion, I can only say that I think that the EU has failed the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and failed its commitment to human rights. But it's also important to note that it's not over. There are many issues in the very near future that have to be addressed immediately. Even if of course, I'm in favor of sanctions, but I elaborated before that I think it's not very realistic. We still have to do that. Maybe also if we can't get sanctions, we should at least make sure that there is no more collaboration with Azerbaijan. We now immediately need to step up our humanitarian aid. We need to put pressure on Azerbaijan if it comes to the people they have recently arrested, because I have no idea in what kangaroo courts they will put them, and we will have to make sure that that doesn't happen, or at least that the people are treated in the most that they are treated with dignity, and that we need to fight to get them out. We need to expand the monitoring mission, because I think that probably in this round there's no doubt that Aliyev is not done yet and that he has more appetite. We need to make sure that Armenia does not pay a terrible price for now turning to the West. That was a move with quite some courage, I would say, but we now have the responsibility to not let Armenia down. And if it comes to that, we just have to put a lot of pressure on the EU leadership. Next week, the European Parliament will have a debate with a resolution on this topic. And I know from the European institutions, the Parliament has been the most active institution in the past, and I'm convinced that it will stay the same. And I hope for a very strong resolution and more pressure on the Commission and the Council, that we can actually achieve something and don't leave Armenia with thoughts and prayers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Rubin, I know we're going to close with you, and I know there's a specific topic you wanted to talk about.
Okay, thank you, Eric, and thank you to Armenophobia. I want to just focus my last remarks on what to expect moving forward and how to counter it. when Turkey took over Greek communities inside what became the Republic of Turkey, they didn't destroy all the churches. They didn't even close all the churches. Oftentimes what they did was they closed the schools. And when the community could no longer send their children to the school to learn their culture, their religion, and so forth, that led many community members to decide to get up and leave. And so we need to recognize the nuances of how ethnic cleansing can occur. Ilham Aliyev says that he wants to integrate, and I believe Talin had talked about, or perhaps Sosi had talked about, the nefariousness of this word integrate. The Armenian people, and they say everyone can live under the Azeri constitution. Never mind that Freedom House ranks Azerbaijan on par freedom-wise with China and Burma, less free than Russia and the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. It's not a compelling offer. What I worry about moving forward even more is the museumification of minorities. Let's put aside this nonsense with regard to ancient Albanians and how Armenians never existed. We talked about Jolfa. We can talk about the sandblasting of Armenian inscriptions and so forth. But what I see in Istanbul, what I see with the Jews in Baku and some Christians in Baku, is trotting out specific representatives only to be a pleasant face in front of visiting dignitaries when their communities themselves have no freedom. And if you want to look at how they vote with their feet, when we look at the statistics and the numbers of Jews who remain in Baku and Azerbaijan, be it mountain Jews, be it Ashkenazi, be it Sephardi, the fact of the matter is, you know that you don't have a defensible position on the part of Azerbaijan when the statistics you're citing are over 20 or 25 years old. The number of Jews in Azerbaijan is probably around 20% of what Azerbaijan said, and certainly it's just a tiny fraction of what existed there at the fall of the Soviet Union. The last point I want to make is just based on this question with regard that came in from the public with regard to think tanks like Hudson and other prominent experts who basically work as elements of this caviar diplomacy. This may be hard for me to say or for you to hear, but I'm going to quote the American Justice, the late American Justice Anthony Scalia. You attack ideas, you don't attack people, because some very good people have very bad ideas. Now, make no mistake, there are people who are corrupt, there are people that are bad, and you're not going to change their minds because their motives aren't pure. Quarantine those people, isolate them, ignore them. They don't have the credibility they or you think they might. The people you want to go after are the people who are saying the wrong thing, but who are not on the tape and who can be convinced. Don't exaggerate. The facts are on your side and the facts are strong enough. And so let me conclude with that. Am I frustrated with some of the arguments I hear with Hudson? Absolutely. I would like to debate people like Luke Coffey, who I think are simply wrong. But at the same time, we need to move forward. There's too much at stake. They want people to be distracted by these Twitter wars or these ad hominem things. And from an outside policy perspective among the non-Armenian community, it just leads people to say a pox in all your houses, cast the entire community aside. That's the result we don't want. So laser focus.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Michael. Sosi, you've got 2 minutes, and then we're going to end this wonderful panel.
Thank you so much for inviting me with such distinguished group of people. I think that each actor involved should draw lessons and modify its policies and behavior. Armenia should draw very serious lessons about past 30 years of diplomacy, state building, and also defense reform. It needs to break away from Russia, and it needs to leave CSTO. It needs to get support from from the US and EU. We need to get support within European Peace Facility. As we know, we applied for it in June and it was rejected. I think it was kind of rushed, both our application and the rejection. We need to prepare and do it again. And now I think we have all reasons to demand the European Union to provide us more support. US is crucial. I agree with Dustin that EU is not likely to be able to adopt sanctions because of Hungary, and not only Hungary, because Bulgaria, Romania, Italy are also receiving gas. However, US, I strongly believe that US is able and needs to adopt sanctions to Azerbaijan, and I hope it will. And we need to adopt our national security strategy in a very serious manner. We need, first of all, to strengthen our sovereignty and territorial integrity with support of the US, EU, India, and other potential partners. On another side, we should, of course, integrate and welcome Armenians from Artsakh by all means. And I don't think that we should try to keep people there without any peacekeeping presence and autonomous status, because it's just not going to be good for neither those people nor us. So we need to seriously strategize about our next steps and, in fact, adopt strategic thinking and planning that we have unfortunately missed for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sosi. Thank you, all of our panelists. I want to close with one final statement. Armenophobia's number one victim is Armenians. Armenophobia's number two victims are Azeris. Because ultimately, no one's going anywhere. And it's much more important to love yourself than you hate your enemies. You cannot build a country or a state or a future with that. And frankly, this regime that has perpetuated this, I can just, unfortunately, we know this is going to happen. After they move on from killing or wiping away the last Armenian from Artsakh, their guns, even in a bigger way, are going to be turned on their own people. Regimes of this nature, you know, whatever they do externally, eventually they do to their own. So I think Armenophobia should be fought not just for our purposes, but frankly for the purposes of in this case, our opponents, and in the larger scale, the world. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you very much, and especially to our panelists.